This is the Chewing the Cud podcast, conversations for the dairy industry, produced in the southwest of England and listened to around the world. Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast. My name's Andrew Jones and with me as always is
Sarah Bolt.
How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm very well, thank you, Andrew. And how are you keeping?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. This is the second episode that is released on the same day, talking about the same topic. So I hope you're taking a listen because they are two completely different episodes.
But both on the same topic.
Yep, that's right. Both on the same topic, both TB related. Now, this is the episode some of you may have heard us teasing about as the episode that we haven't been able to talk about. This was actually recorded back in December 2025. And since then, we've basically had an embargo on it. They've asked us not to release it, which we haven't. We haven't spoken about it. It's just been sitting there. I honestly thought we weren't going to get round to releasing. And then
we had a few close ones where we nearly did.
Yes, we had a few close ones where we nearly did. And so I'd kind of moved on, hence why the other one was recorded with one of our guests on TB. But then they suddenly went, you can release it. And it's like, yay! How are we going to do it? Because we don't really have space in our schedule. It's kind of planned. So what we sat down and decided to do was release both on the same day. So both completely different, both really relevant topics on TB. The only thing, it doesn't date it really, but there is a reference towards the end of this one saying that they were waiting for an update in the spring as to the way forward from the government. That has now happened. That was the roadmap that was released in June of this year, so 2026. And that is obviously the topic of our other podcast. So they both relate very much with each other.
But this one's a really interesting bit of research that was funded by Innovate UK, looking at innovative test for TB.
Oh, this really could revolutionise how people test for TB, even if it's just as a base, a control to monitor, and then maybe if there's a response, then have to do an action of the traditional skin test. I don't know. That's for other people to decide. But if that could be used just for that purpose, it will save stress and time for our listeners, for you guys listening, but also for your cattle. And surely that's got to be a massive win for everybody.
Definitely.
But yes, as Sarah said, our guest forgot to say it during the podcast. They really wanted us to say it here in the intro. This was funded by some work by Innovate UK. And there was lots of different people involved. But otherwise, really, yeah, go take a listen. There's some really interesting stuff. And if you haven't already listened to the other one, please do, because it's all related, all good information on TB. So, yeah, go and enjoy and see what you think.
Farming today is a constant balance, rising costs, tighter margins, and a need to get more from every input. At Kemin, we understand the complexity you manage every day. As a family-owned company, we've built our business on helping producers operate more efficiently and with greater confidence. That's why we work alongside you, delivering science-backed solutions that support performance, protect feed quality, and optimize results across your operation. Kemin helps you turn today's challenges into measurable progress that drives long-term profitability.
This episode is brought to you by Chewing the Cud Ltd, completely independent, practical nutrition advice for the dairy and beef industries. Whether you need nutrition support, cow signals advice and training, or ROMS accredited mobility scoring, we tailor the advice to your farm and your requirements. For the full range of services, visit www.chewingthecud.com or email nutrition@chewingthecud.com. This episode is also brought to you by Chewing the Cud Ltd. We now offer first aid training designed for agriculture and farming. delivered by a registered first aid at work trainer and experienced minor injuries practitioner. For more details, visit www.chewingthecud.com or email training@chewingthecud.com. Hello, I'm Andrew Jones.
And I'm Sarah Bolt.
Sarah's Time Today is kindly brought to you by Kingshay. And together we bring you the Chewing the Cud podcast, kitchen table conversations for the dairy industry.
Whether you're a farmer, advisor, processor, or anywhere else in the supply chain, we have topics and episodes that will interest you.
We cover the practical and technical aspects of dairy farming.
We want to make you think about what you're doing and ask yourself whether it could be done differently.
Each episode, we speak with specialists from inside and outside the industry about their area of expertise.
Subscribe and listen for free on your favourite podcast platform.
Or sign up at www.chewingthecud.com for episode notifications so you never miss a release.
You'll find links to all our socials there too, including our Instagram, Chewing the Cud Podcast, all one word and no G.
Or get in touch directly at podcast@chewingthecud.com.
If you enjoy what we do, please share it and leave us a review.
Enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome back to Chewing the Cud podcast. Our guests, well, they're returning for a third time, so I guess you could say they don't need any introduction. We have Rachel Hayton from Synergy Farm Health. Good morning, Rachel.
Good morning.
And we have Sarah Tomlinson from, well, TBAS, I guess is probably the best title for you, is it? Or
Yes, multiple hats.
Multiple
Good
hats.
morning.
In this instance, we're Sarah from TBAS. I mean, we've both been guests before. I think you were our first guest, both of you, that have been on for the third time.
It's a pleasure.
I know, and I don't know what that says.
But I know, as I say, just briefly, like usual, Rachel, brief introduction from yourself, please.
So, hello, I'm Rachel Hayton. I'm a vet in farm animal practice and at Synergy Farm Health in the southwest of England, and I run our research programme.
Sarah.
So, Sarah Tomlinson, I am also a farm vet. I've been out of clinical practice for a couple of years now. The last 5-6 years of my life, I've been part of the TB advisory service. And 2 years ago in March, I joined AHDB.
So if you want to know more, obviously listen to the previous podcasts with both of them. They've always been good information. So we're here today to talk about, guess what? TB. So I suppose a bit of an update from when Sarah spoke to us last in March 2025, I think it was. But there's some new work that's come out. I suppose probably, Rachel, you're probably the best person to start with the background on this.
Yes, so Synergy Farm Health, my practice, has an association with Sure Farm, which it works on the Enferplex TB test, which is a serological test for TB. Actually, my husband Alice has been working on it for about the last 10 years. He's taken it through 2 rounds of validation with the World Office of Animal Health. It's validated for use in blood and milk, but more recently they got it validated for use in bulk milk as well, which, as you can imagine, has massive potential to take some of the heat out of TB testing. So in 2023, I ran a study looking at the use of bulk milk TB testing using Enferplex. And it was a big collaboration. We worked with UK Agri-Tech Centre. We worked with NMR, who really coordinated all the testing and carried out the testing. And we worked with SRUC, based in Edinburgh, and they have access to the government surveillance database for TB. They use it for their other research, and they got permission to access it for this research as well. So we put together all our testing results on TB. We enrolled 5,000 herds across GB, so England, Wales, Scotland, and we tested them 3 times in 2023. And then the SRUC put those results together with the the government's TB surveillance database. So it was a really big GB-wide study that I was really excited to be involved in.
So did you, just to clarify, you said 2023 this was, these tests were taken?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 3 times. So 3 months apart, we tested each herd 3 times.
I should say I was listening back to the one we did with Sarah on TB from March 2025, and there was just a throwaway line in there for the Enferplex test. And at the time, it meant nothing to me, but obviously now this is like, okay, this is what this means. So should say I sort of, a little bit of history, I sort of saw Rachel Deny at the Cream Awards last year, and you sort of said, I've got something, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. And of course, that got my intrigue. And then when we saw Rachel recently for the Cow Recovery podcast, it was like, can you talk about it yet? And she went, well, I can. And so, so obviously we rely on this podcast, and here we are today. So there's some interesting stuff come out of this. So I suppose the first thing I should say really is if it's a bulk milk test straight away, that's got to be less stress for the farmer and for the animals involved, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't actually tell you now how many days of testing it took at NMR, but they carried out 18,000 tests as part of the study, and it was peanuts. If you can imagine how long 18,000 herd tests take if you're skin testing, it took them a few days. It was astonishing how much easier it is.
And just the size of this study, Rachel, to have 5,000 herds. What are we across GB now? Is it sort of under 9,000 herds? So
yeah, we thought we got about two-thirds of the national herd, which was an amazing achievement by NMR, actually, because they helped us with the recruitment. They held meetings with the milk processors, and we recruited that way. I mean, there was it was really complicated to set up. Obviously, we needed to get permission from government. We needed to successfully apply for a grant, and we needed the dairies to sign up to it, because of course we can't do anything without their permission. And we had really strict rules in place. So we got permission from government to do this, but one of the conditions was the participating farmers were not allowed to know their results. I don't know their results individually because they were all sent direct, not to SRUC for analysis, and then they were immediately anonymized as soon as they were matched up. So it was very secure study, but we had to tell government the positive results, but on the condition that there was absolutely no action taken. So there were no consequences for any of the farms that took part in the study.
So could people opt out, or was it they had to opt in?
Absolutely, yeah. There was any dairy farm could opt out. They were informed about the study through their processor. They could opt out. We got a few asking to be taken out, and we took them out of the study, and they wouldn't have been tested or participated.
But obviously, as you say, it's not just concentrated, say, here in the southwest, where, let's be blunt, it's a TB hotspot. It was across the country. These were just herds all over the mainland UK. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I think it wasn't an exactly even distribution, but we got Wales, we got Scotland, we got England, all over the country. So the high edge and low risk areas.
So I guess maybe Sarah, that might be Sarah Tomlinson, I should say, as I've got two Sarahs again. Maybe it's time to bring you into here. Now, last time you talked about let me get it right.
Specificity.
Thank you. That's the word.
One of those words, isn't it?
It is. But would you like to explain again what that is and what the comparison of this test is compared to, say, a standard skin test?
Yeah, so I think for me, the skin test potentially is the best herd level test at the moment that we've got, because it is really, really specific. And that means we can be really confident that an animal that reacts to the skin test and is positive is truly infected with TB. It's quoted at 99.98%. So false positives are really low. The downside of the skin test is its sensitivity, which is the opposite almost of the specificity. And that's how confident we are that a negative is truly a negative. And we know the current skin test that we use on a good day, if the test is done perfectly, is around 80%. It misses a large proportion, let's say. So whenever we're doing the skin test, we know we are not identifying all the positive animals. Whereas these serology testing, and I hope I mentioned it in the previous podcast, potentially are more sensitive. So they find more of those infected animals. The downside, though, is because TB is a notifiable disease, is that we have rules, legislation on how we deal with suspicion of disease. So any test positive animal, in theory, has to be culled out of the farm within 10 working days. But importantly, that farm is put under movement restrictions and can't trade. And it was the FCN report that came out January this year that really highlighted to me, it really opened my eyes that actually TB as a disease isn't impactful for our dairy businesses, because not like Yonis or BBD, or even IBR, where we see sick animals, we don't see sick TB animals because of our control measures. They're taking out infected animals all the time. So rarely does it impact our farm businesses. It's the control measures. So when people like me and through the TB advisory service are talking to our farmers saying, oh, you could use more sensitive tests, we could find more infected animals, which would make you go clearer quicker and keep you clearer for longer. The disincentive is those animals have to be removed immediately, ultimately, which can have a massive impact on the volume of milk you're putting in the tank. So, and also potentially put under more and longer movement restrictions. So the timing of this research coming out to me is amazing, because DEFRA in England is going through a strategy refresh. Quite a lot of people have been involved in working groups on looking at exactly this. How do these sort of tests fit into policy going forward? Because people like me and British Cattle Veterinary Association and lots of vets in practice have been shouting for a long time, let us be part of the management of the control, because we do know our farms really well, and we know what the risks there, I suppose, are willing to take with engaging in some of these more sensitive tests. But more importantly, let us have a management protocols to manage these animals out the herd. And I think I spoke a little bit about it on the previous podcast, managing them like we do Yonis positives. So we're not putting the herd under, more movement restrictions. We're not saying they need to leave the herd within 10 working days, and they can stay and leave at the end of the lactation, say. We don't put them back in calf, or we serve them to a terminal sire, and the calf then goes into the food chain. So we're stopping that infection cycle. And it was the Godfrey review, which was a review of sort of the science and evidence around TB, that was fundamental to looking at some of this strategy refresh. They are really clear in that, and these are kind of world leading experts on TB, that exactly that. Farm vets should be having a say in how farms manage TB at a farm level. These serological tests that are kind of being, they're with us, aren't they? And the potential of the bulk milk test could be revolutionary, I think was the word. I might have changed the word a bit.
That was the word I used in my study title. Yes, I like that.
Yeah, so the timing of it is good. And I think TB has always been a political hot potato. It uses a lot of taxpayer money to pay for control measures. Farmers feel like they don't have a lot of say in how they control it. But I do think we're at a time where we've got so much science and evidence, so much new science and evidence coming through. And I think I might be very biased, but I think the TB advisory service, all the work we've done, has changed the mindset of farmers and vets to engage in TB as an infectious disease and know more about it. Whereas before we were just the testers. We went out, did the test and said, oh, you've passed, oh, you've failed. And we didn't have a say So we were slightly disengaged as vets, but I think things like this research and the strategy refresh hopefully will put a spark up our vets to want to engage in this.
I've said it before, and I mean, probably in the previous podcast, but I mean, the whole TB thing has changed. And, I'm thinking back to when I was a kid, teenager, TB, if you got TB, it was hush hush, you didn't tell a word, whereas now you didn't say a word to anybody. Whereas now it's so much more prevalent. It's almost a case of, well, are you or aren't you? It's almost become more open, hasn't it? It's not the dirty secret, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I think it is in some of the sort of high risk areas because it's part of everyday farming life. It has become, and that's almost the problem in some ways. People are living with it in inverted commas. I hate to say that because I know it's not as simple as that. Whereas actually, I've done quite a lot of work into some of the lower risk areas where Rachel's study has shown there is some level of TB. And in those areas, it still can be that kind of, you become that social pariah, that you don't go to market, you don't go to the local pub, because again, if you cause a TB breakdown in some of those low risk areas, it kicks off a radial test. So all your neighbours have to start to test. So there is very much a who caused this. And one of the things I say when I do meetings in those areas, if you hear of somebody going down with TB locally, don't try and point the finger. Actually give them a call and say, how are you? Because TB restrictions and all of the stress that goes with it is massive from a mental health perspective. So and actually for those people, they probably weren't the people that brought TB into the area. They're just the first people to be tested positive because of the moderate sensitivity of our skin test that we've got, because we're using that as a pre-movement test, which Rachel can now.
Going back to what you said, Sarah, it's so true that it's the control measures that are really, really punitive on farmers. But at the same time, it's still really important that we control this disease. We need to be TB free to trade. We need TB control measures because it's a zoonosis, it spreads to other species. And actually, there are occasionally animals that pop up at the abattoir, riddled with visible lesions and that have just bypassed the skin testing. And, it is a serious disease. As you say, we're sort of keeping a lid on it now in terms of clinical signs, but it's still not being in a good place. We're not properly controlling it. Can I pick up on something else you said as well?
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned, we talked about specificity, and you mentioned that the skin test is the most specific test. So in other words, you said it's very unlikely to throw up a false positive, which is true. If you get positive on a skin test, you can treat it as a positive. But we worked out the specificity of the bulk milk test. I won't explain how we did it, but it's a difficult thing to do, because to work out a specificity, you need a true negative population to use your test on, and it's up for debate. How many samples can you take from the UK that you absolutely 100% know are a true negative population? There's some of the low risk areas, but it's difficult. And anyway, so we did our best to define what we thought was an absolute true negative population from our samples. And that was based on being in low risk areas, not having ever had a breakdown, being far enough away from other breakdowns. And then we tested our specificity, and we came up with 99.3% specific for the bulk milk test, which is pretty good. The skin test is listed as being 99.98, which sounds better, but there's a big difference between those two figures. The skin test figure is off for an individual animal, and the bulk milk test specificity is for a herd. So if you test 250 individual animals, your overall herd specificity is going to be much lower than that on the skin test. So just to shout out, we were pretty pleased with our specificity. We think at a herd level, it's extremely high specificity. In other words, if you get a positive result, you can believe it. It's not going to be a false positive.
So just picking up on that, Rachel, then, and something that Sarah just alluded to, that Sarah alluded to the fact that there was some TB detected in your study in some of those low risk areas. So sort of putting that statement and what you've just said about the specificity, can't say it. Tell us a little bit more about the study and what it found.
Yeah, so I think we ended up testing just over 4,800 herds got tested all three times. And the total positive out of all of those 4,800 herds, 25% of them tested positive at least once. So we've got reason to think that a quarter of that population that we tested are positive for TB, aka they are infected herds. The thing that surprised us when we first got that figure, it was higher than we were expecting, I'll be honest. But when we actually looked at the database that we were comparing against, so the TB surveillance database, in 2023 of those herds, 24% of them were under restriction at some point in 2023 for TB. So it actually wasn't that far out from the government's own data, and we were really surprised by that, because we'd always thought that the incidence in the dairy herd was a bit lower than that. We'd always thought, I think the figure for 2023 was 7% across the whole all cattle herds. Sarah, you might not have that figure off the top of your head, but we'd always assumed that the level in beef herds and the level in dairy herds was about the same, and in fact that's not the case. So nearly a quarter of dairy herds in the UK were under restriction at some point in 2023. When we actually looked at in more detail, obviously those two populations didn't completely overlap. So some of the Enferplex positive herds had actually never been under restriction in 2023. So what we found was that 20% of herds that were OTF, so they'd never had a positive test in 2023, they weren't under restriction, they were trading freely, they thought they were okay, 20% of those tested Enferplex positive.
We should just say OTF is officially tuberculosis free, isn't it?
Indeed, yeah.
And what that does back up, though, what we've all thought for a very long time, is when farms go officially TB free after having their 2 clear skin tests, we know they are not infection free. And that's how TB is transported into new herds through trade. When people sell those calves, those young stock, or even breeding animals, when they're officially TB free, we know that they could be infected animals. And that's the whole premise of the stuff that I talk about, using the IBTB map to look at TB history before you do buy, to, match the risk you are prepared to take with those purchased animals versus the length of time that herd's been testing TB free. If they are animals going for finishing and they're going into a shed, it could be fine to buy off a herd that has just come off TB, as long as you're managing the spread of that risk, because those animals will be dead within 12, 18 months. But if you're buying breeding animals, you might want to be a little bit more risk averse as to which animals you are buying. So for me, that's where this sort of test, being able to know which herds are more or less risky, to understand what then we need to do to manage that risk, is where we need to think about what policy goes forward to help farmers not buy in infected cattle.
So the outcome is you found more herds through the bulk test than were through the skin test, or herds that were no longer under restriction were showing up as having some infection in the bulk test. What's the government response been to this?
The one thing I will say is that nobody was really... this wasn't good news. It was more than we were hoping to find, but nobody was really surprised by it. In the same way that Sarah just said, we already know about risky practices. There's already lots of advice about how to lower your risk when buying in from herds that are allegedly TB free. And when we looked at the risk factors for what was the risk of being Enferplex positive, they absolutely matched all the risk factors that we already understand. So we weren't finding Enferplex positive herds in these kind of proper TB-free areas. They were very much in association with, they were geographically close to outbreaks. They were in the higher risk areas. They matched all the same risk factors that we already understand for TB. So they were very, if you like, they were very believable because they matched what we already knew. But it is telling us that we need to be doing something else to prevent these risky cattle movements, because they're just stopping us getting on top of TB.
So where do you see this going? Do you see this maybe being used as a monitoring situation? And if it reaches above a certain level, you have to go in with a skin test, so that maybe people don't need to skin test every 60 days or whatever the legislation is at the time and the place? Or is this something that can be done on an individual animal basis? Is it purely done on a bulk herd basis? And I say, how do you see it being used moving forward, just as a monitoring tool, or do you think it can replace some of the current requirements?
Obviously there's a strategy review going on right now, and we don't know what's going to come out of that exactly. But I think there is a big need for better testing at the individual animal level as well as the herd level. But we need to look at measures that are not as punitive on farmers. So we need to look at risk-based management that will stop the spread of infection, but not just put people out of business. It's no good identifying more infection if you end up just putting a farm out of business. So the way we would see the bulk milk test being used is probably much more at a surveillance level, probably being used by governments rather than individuals, but I could be wrong on that. It's certainly an extra tool in the surveillance box that can be used to identify high-risk herds. We would love to see a sort of different status, perhaps an inconclusive herd status being instigated, so that we could have enhanced testing in those herds and just prevent these movements that are currently spreading TB. And we would love to see measures that could allow, as Sarah's already said, that would allow some of these high-risk animals to stay in the herd and get managed out, perhaps looking at segregation, perhaps looking at risk-based culling. And that would need enhanced individual animal testing as well, really, in order to do that. So there's still a lot of work to do. That's going to be my next plan, is to run a study looking at risk-based management of some of those positive animals.
And how do you see this in comparison to, say, something like the gamma test? Because there was certainly a vet locally to me at the time when gamma first came out was saying this is the answer to everything, and was advising his clients to gamma test, take out all the positives on the gamma test, which they did. He said that will clear out all the TB. And then 2 or 3 years later, they were finding it coming back in. How do you think this compares to something like that? Is it another, I'm going to say false hope? Maybe that's the wrong term to use. But how do you see it fitting in the overall bigger picture, just as we said, as a surveillance tool to then implement then, oh, right, you've reached a certain level, you must do a skin test, or how do you see it being used? Or do you think people will go, hey, right, let's just do the herd so we can manage, like you're suggesting, those animals we know, right, okay, she hasn't come up as a positive there, but she's coming up as a positive via the bulk, the milk tests, an individual milk test or something, and then, okay, we treat it like yonis and we work them out the herd. How do you see it? I guess you've said that's how you'd like to see it, but how does it all fit in, say, compared to something like the gamma test in the past?
So there's no doubt that the gamma test, Sarah will say more about this, I'm sure, but she's actually the expert on this. But there's no doubt the gamma test finds more infected animals than the skin test. It's probably also a bit lower on specificity, but that's the hit you have to take, I suppose, maybe. But what we found with our research is that, so the gamma test and the skin test utilise something called cell-mediated immunity, which is one arm of the immune system. The serological tests, such as Enferplex, utilize humoral immunity, which is the antibody system. So it's a different arm of the immune system. And if you want to really pick out all of your infected animals, you need to use both of those tools. And actually what we find is that when one is in the ascendancy, the other one not so much. So they will miss, each one will miss animals that would test positive to the other one, and they alternate as well. It's not a static thing. So one will be up, the other one will be down, and vice versa. So if you want to have a good TB surveillance system, you need to be using both of those sorts of tests. And at the moment, we're very restricted in what we can do. And as Sarah said, farmers and their vets are not really given much freedom to actually manage this out themselves. And it would be lovely to see fewer restrictions on private testing so that farmers could actually tailor things to their own situation and really get a grip and manage out this disease.
So just to clarify, this can be done on an individual basis as well?
There's the Enferplex test can be used on individual blood and individual milk.
Sarah, as Rachel was suggesting, you might have a bit more to say on the gamma.
No, nothing really to add, other than at the time, I suppose, Andrew, it was the best, it was the new test, and it was more sensitive, like Rachel said, so it did find more positive animals, more infected animals, I should say, and this is just another tool to add to the toolbox. It's understanding the specificity and the sensitivity of all these different tests, what parts of the immune system, like Rachel has described, that they're looking for in order to use them in the right herd at the right time, and interpret the results in the way that you can manage that on your farm. I mean, we use different tests all the time for lots of different things. For mastitis, we've got culture and PCR testing, both looking for sort of the bacteria, or the PCR test looking for the sort of DNA of that bacteria. BVD is another one. We do serology testing to look for antibodies, but we do virus to look for the antigen, to look for the testing. So it's not unusual to run tests in series together or in parallel, one after the other, to do this sort of diagnostic testing. What's important, and I think what's new, is how we then manage those animals that are testing positive, because at the moment, like I said, with TB testing, they are all just culled within sort of 10 working days. What also is interesting, which I'm learning, and I'm sure Rachel's coming across as well, is that obviously TB costs the taxpayer £100 million every year. We know governments are really tight on money. Everybody's got to manage their own household budget, their own farm budget, just like government has to, and you have to make decisions on where you spend your money and where you don't. And that's been a long discussion through some of the groups I'm in Welsh Government and in DEFRA, the stakeholder groups, is who pays? Because actually, with beef prices as high as they are, the government are paying out quite a lot of money on compensation out of their TB budget. So, but more and more, if farmers can manage these animals out of their herd and not have the impact on their bulk milk levels, they are willing to potentially pay for these tests if they can manage the results of them in a way that suits their business. And I think that's another key kind of crossroads we're at the minute, that actually if farmers get more control, they are more willing to pay, because they'll see the long-term benefits of getting TB out of their herd and not having that disastrous breakdown 6 months, a year later, when they get more skin test positives. If we get this right, we could stop the next breakdown. And as I said, it's the control measures, that breakdown, that impacts the business. So I think, again, this, we're just at a really great time, I think, with TB. We have culled an awful lot of badgers. We've controlled that wildlife reservoir very successfully. Yes, the government are moving from lethal to non-lethal methods for wildlife control. They have just put out a tender for a large amount of money to do a badger vaccination field force to manage that rising population again. So we've got to be clever about how we manage TB going forward. We are at some of the lowest levels we've had for 20 odd years. Rachel might say, she's pulling a face in that this is based on the skin test, not on more sensitive testing. But I think we are in a positive place, and actually introducing some of these new tools and these new policies, new ways of managing TB could be really positive for the industry.
Yeah, I will debate that we're in the best place we've ever been, Sarah. I don't think we are at all, and that's based on confirmed cases. What does that even mean? We know that positive, that all breakdowns are real breakdowns. So yeah, I'm going to debate that. But what we certainly need better ways of assessing risk as well in these animals, and one of the things that I think we need to look at more carefully is when is an animal at higher risk of shedding? When is an animal more infectious? So I don't think anybody understands this well. I mean, obviously we know that if an animal's got visible lesions, it's going to be at high risk of shedding, but that's all a bit late by then. So the Enferplex test actually tests for 11 antigens, and if the test has got 2 or more antigens positive, in other words, antibodies to 2 or more antigens, then it classes as a positive. But what I'd like to do next is a study looking at the sort of antigen positivity from 2 up to 11 and see if we can somehow relate that to risk of passing on the infection, because that would really be useful information that we could use that would help farmers in decision making.
Now, you've talked about managing this out the herd and used yonis as an example. I guess my question is, how does this TB and yonis are very closely related in terms of what they are. How does this affect, because in the past we've been told, don't do a yonis test so many days after a TB test. I believe that's changed. Maybe one of you'd like to explain that, but what's the chance of this being a yonis result rather than a TB result? Is there any potential risk of crossover that the bulk test is picking up the wrong thing?
So that work has been done. We're quite confident that when we get a bulk milk positive, it's picking up TB. It is a more sensitive test if you do it in the 30 days after a skin test. So we know that the skin test will prime the animal, and it's got much better sensitivity in that 30 days afterwards. But actually, there has been work done showing that if you repeatedly skin test an animal, it doesn't actually reduce I'm going to do everyone's heads in now, but it doesn't reduce the specificity if you do it in that window. So you can still believe a positive result, but you will have better sensitivity doing it in that window.
But there's no chance that it will show up from a yoni. It's showing a yonis positive rather than a TB positive.
No, absolutely not. I mean, they're related, but they're not the same. So they picked antigens. So an antigen is basically a protein that is part of the bacteria, and you test for antibodies to that particular protein. So the antigens they picked are not found on the yonis bacteria.
So you've both used the word revolutionary with this serological test. Can you just share a little bit more with us why you've used that word?
I'd be interested to hear what Sarah says, but I think one of the issues here is the sheer pain and expense of carrying out a skin test. If we could get better surveillance with less skin testing, I think that would be revolutionary. Of course, the ultimate goal is to control TB and be in a good place, isn't it? But certainly, even in low risk areas, if you can imagine, you might only be testing for TB once every 4 years, which is annoying. But if you had some TB coming in the intervening 4 years, you might miss it. So you could be doing background surveillance absolutely painlessly and cheaply, which would pick up infection much quicker. In the high-risk areas, our guys who are having to test every 6 months, there is evidence that if you test that frequently, you're lowering the the sensitivity of the skin test even further. So if you could substitute even some of those tests with a bulk milk test, it's cheaper, it's easier. The cows don't have to go through and get stressed. The farm workers don't have to spend a whole day doing that. And possibly you'd end up with better surveillance, not worse surveillance. So it's just a win-win.
For me, the revolutionary part is we've now got evidence, and we now need this strategy refresh that DEFRA is going through, and Welsh Government through their programme board and their technical advisory group, to look at this evidence and then work out how we can best fit that into our TB policy. And what we need to be mindful of, though, is there is international, I suppose, legislation and rules around access to trade, as Rachel alluded to enable us still to be able to say we are officially TB free as a country, and to know that we're not trading infected products, I suppose, to other countries. So that's the tricky bit, is how do we fit these tests in and still allow farmers to manage those infected animals out the herd and still abide by our sort of trade rules going forward. So revolutionary is the evidence and the science, but we now need a willingness and an ambition, I think, from the stakeholder groups and the core strategy refresh group to put this into policy, I guess.
So really what we've got is we've got a great result in terms of trialling it. It's now up to government of how that's used moving forward. There is no, at the time of recording, there is no definitive message from government how this will be used moving forward.
So at the moment, there is the facility for farmers to choose to use the Enferplex blood test in herds, but there's a process, a level of sort of testing that you have to go through to get to that stage where that will be permitted. I think what some of the groups and discussions I've been involved in is actually, can we start to use these more sensitive tests earlier in a breakdown? So we're not waiting for that herd to get heavily infected before and go a long way into those movement restrictions before we're allowed to use them, and even use them in officially TB-free herds, which at the moment you can't use other than the skin test for pre-movement testing or the gamma test with permission. You can't use any other test in those officially TB-free herds. I think I'm right saying that.
And given our study findings, we know that, well, we already knew, but we've demonstrated the proportion of those herds that have infection. So absolutely, I'd agree, it makes sense to investigate that. New Zealand have actually looked at adopting the bulk milk Enferplex test. They're just looking at results from screening the entire national herd, and they're considering using it as their standard surveillance instead of the skin test, because they're at the absolute tail end of their TB control. They've had a really successful campaign, and they're looking to cut costs, but they are looking to finish off TB as well at the same time.
I was just going to chip in. What the other podcast that I was involved in was the GB calf strategy, and a main part of that is how TB impacts calf health and welfare. And I suppose the caveat, and I think what we need to talk about, because there might be farmers thinking, I will be that herd that you're talking about that might need more sensitive pre-movement testing, or what do we do with those calves that need ultimately to leave those dairy herds to go into the beef supply chain? And part of the GB calf strategy is, how do we address that problem? Because at the moment it is very much supply and demand. There's too many calves for the spaces in those units. So I think, again, part of the strategy refresh has been looking at biosecurity and trade and how we manage these riskier animals that potentially are coming from officially TB-free herds, but we know they are higher risk. to stop that risk from those units spreading out. So we have approved finishing units and licensed finishing units and even isolation units that can take some of these higher risk animals and manage them in a less risky way. So it's not that we're going to penalise those farms that we think do have higher levels of infection, meaning they can't sell calves or can't get animals off their herd. Policy has also got to address that side of it, if that makes sense.
Thinking of calves, it makes me think of beef as well. Not the bulk milk test, obviously you can't really do that. But with the younger calves, how young can you go? Because I know, at the moment, I've had friends just before we recorded the podcast with you, Sarah, last year, that went down with TB, and their comment was they've come in, is it gamma test, I think it was, and they can only do it up to, they can't do it under 6 months of age. And so their comment was, well, effectively, we're leaving this pool of animals. Why can't they come back and then retest those animals at 6 months? So in 6 months' time. So how young with the serum test can you test these animals under this testing regime?
You can test them to quite young. Well, obviously, you want to avoid maternally derived immunity, but there's not a great deal of research on testing those young animals, and I know there are theories out there about when animals first get infected with TB, and we don't really know, but yeah, they can be tested. Experience suggests that you won't find many positives, and it's a slow burner of a disease.
I guess all of these things just highlight that we do need more research going forward as to how and when this transmission, as you alluded to earlier, as to those different proteins, as to measuring 2 of them or 11 of them, and actually getting a better understanding of the disease. Can you sort of talk a little bit more about that and how that might fit in?
Are you asking about sort of what further research we'd like to be doing? I've got a long list.
Your wish list. If the pot of money was there, what's really high up?
And Rachel and I, we had a pre-podcast chat, and that was the hour and a half later that we went into, didn't we, Rachel, as our long wish list?
So my immediate top of my wish list is I do want to look at this risk managing positive animals, because that's crucial for farmers, because that's the thing that just absolutely kills them is the restrictions and the compulsory culling. And if we find more animals, we cannot just be more punitive on farms under restriction. That's not going to work. So we need to be real. We need to understand where the infection is, and then we need realistic, non-punitive ways of managing it. So I really want to look at risk-based management and risk-based culling. I think there are some herds that might be able to manage segregation, and there are some herds that might be able to be not able to segregate, but could do risk-based culling, where as Sarah mentioned earlier, you're culling an animal at the end of lactation, or you're breeding her to beef, or you're managing her out over time, but without destroying your milk production or your replacement strategy. And likewise, it would be lovely to be able to look at your replacement stock and say, who are the high risk animals who I actually don't want to be bringing into the herd at all, and we're going to rear them for beef. So yeah, that's. I've written the proposal. I've got the partners. I've just got to find the funding now. So that's definitely one.
Do you think there's maybe a sustainability angle as well? Because I know I've been involved with somebody online who's gone, dairy farmers keep too many replacements. It's like, yeah, but they do it because they're afraid they'll suddenly get that TB breakdown. They lose 10 whatever animals. They've got to have them coming through. But if we knew this as part of a managed way of working animals out, instead of suddenly losing them, you could go, well, actually, I don't need to keep those 35% replacement. I can only keep 30% replacement, whatever it happens to be for your herd, because you know that actually, if we do have these, we can manage it out the herd in a much controlled way. Therefore, I don't need to keep the same replacements for fear of having a breakdown, and therefore it makes it more sustainable more sustainable business moving forward as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a small piece of work that I'm just waiting to get the sort of final report on, looking at exactly that, the environmental impacts that TB has on dairy units, because there's all sorts of things, not just keeping more replacements than you need, but actually keeping the Onis positive or the high cell count cow because you've just lost 10 reactors out of your main herd. There's a group of guys, and I think I've mentioned it before, in Pembrokeshire that are working with their vets doing exactly this. And they're looking at just the skin test results. I think they are including Enferplex in some of those herds, and about identifying those higher risk animals. And their argument is actually exactly what you've just said. They don't have to keep higher numbers of replacements because they've got time to bring those animals into the herd. And equally, they don't have to buy in either, because they can bring in their own replacements because they're managing these higher risk animals out. They're also looking at these sort of transmission pathways. And I think they're at the stage now where they've got calves coming out of some of these animals they've identified as higher risk, but they have put in those management interventions, pasteurization of colostrum, separate calving pens, different protocols. And those calves are now being born. So I think what will be interesting is to hopefully those heifers might come through actually not high risk animals because of those management. But that's kind of a group of farmers and vets doing it. What we need is the scientific peer-reviewed evidence that we are doing this with the right animals, and equally culling out the right animals, as Rachel said. I mean, the common question I always get is, well, you've told me I need to cull this resolved IR or this, bovine only reactor, but when and what risk really is it to my herd? And we can't answer that question. We're sort of managing them differently and culling them out because why wouldn't you, rather than having the evidence, if that makes sense.
And we're in a tricky space now, aren't we? Because it's always by the time we wait for the research to prove everything conclusively, it's too late. So we have to try and do the research, yes. But while we're doing the research, we need to use everything that we already understand about how to control diseases, and we need to collaborate between all parties and do what we think is best in the meantime to get on top of this. And I think I hate to say it, but that's not been happening in the past, and it's starting to happen now. And it's really encouraging to see these collaborations going forward.
I absolutely agree, because actually TB, and I say this very lightly and I know it isn't, is just another infectious disease. And actually vets and farmers work really well with management protocols for biosecurity of buying in, keeping risk from neighbours down. And we need to be looking at TB in the same way, because we do know the basics of infectious disease control, and there's nothing stopping us engaging in those.
And it puts it back in the hands of the farmers then, doesn't it, to control that? If you think of it, as you say, as that infectious disease in the same way as Yonis, in the same way as BBD, etc., that actually farmers are in control of their own destiny, which is where they want to be and where they need to be for their business.
I think for too long, TB has been this pitched battle, hasn't it, between different factions. It's been pro-badger versus anti-badger. It's been government versus non-government. And it's just not the way to solve anything. We all need to work together, and we all need to accept that there's all these different factors that feed into it.
Where do you see, you talked about moving forward and what you'd like, where do you see the potential of maybe vaccinating TB, and how does that affect maybe this test? I don't know.
So at the moment, government are looking, they're in phase 3 of cattle vaccination field trials, looking at using another skin test. They're calling it the DIVA test because it's to be able to differentiate vaccinated and infected animals, to be able to use the BCG vaccine in cattle, which we know works. It doesn't work amazingly, but it doesn't work amazingly in humans or badgers, but we get some immunity, and that's better than no immunity. So we've got the BCG vaccine, but if you vaccinate cattle, about 80% of them would test positive to the current skin test, for all the reasons Rachel talked about, because it's got the same proteins in it that we're testing for. So this DIVA test is been through sort of specificity and sensitivity testing. Unfortunately, in phase 2, it identified too many false positives, shall we say. And all of this is explained on the TB Hub webpage. And so they're now rolling it out into a bigger number of animals to see if it was 2 false positives out of, I think it was 300 something animals versus 2 false positives out of 1,000 animals, because obviously that's a very different sort of rate of false positives, I suppose. Again, we need to be mindful about how legislation and policy keeps up with cattle vaccination. Where do we use it? How does it impact trade even within devolved nations? Because we saw the impact that blue tongue vaccination had, because Wales and England and Scotland had different rules. Also, it's at the moment, it's illegal to trade products and animals that are vaccinated with BCG. So we need to be mindful about how it shouldn't, hopefully, impact our trade. So it's not as simple as just going out and putting a vaccine into a cow like it is for sort of other diseases, because of the rules and regulations we have around TB. But it should be another tool in the toolbox. It won't be the magic wand. We can't just use vaccination. We will still have to test and remove those infected animals. We'll still have to think about trade of potentially high-risk animals and the wildlife reservoir as well. You know, how do we manage that going forward? So it's another tool in the toolbox, I think, cattle vaccination.
Yeah, it worries me a little bit. I must admit that we focus constantly on something on the horizon when we've got all of these tools absolutely ready to use now, and we're not getting the most out of them. So, yeah, it worries me that there's certain sectors pinning their hopes on vaccination when we could be doing so much a better job with all the things we have at our disposal currently. And I don't like the idea of having to rely on only one diagnostic test again, the DIVA test, because or any other diagnostic test would have to go through lengthy validation in order to show that it was useful in vaccinated animals, and then we're years off again. So let's stick with what we've got under our noses now and use those properly.
I was going to say, I know the answer is probably how long is a piece of string, but you both talked about the fact that we're at sort of a crossroads, maybe, or we're under review as to where we go. Where do you you've got the results from this test? When do you think we might have some official guidance as to how and where it will be used? Because you say, if it's here, let's use it, let's make the most of it. But when do you think we'll get rather than going, okay, we've got to pay for this privately or whatever, when do you think, right, we might have some kind of strategy in place? Because you said it's currently under review with the government.
So spring, I think, was the aim to have the strategy refresh out. Obviously, it does need to be signed off by ministers, so that's kind of can sometimes depends what else is happening, obviously, in the political world. But spring could be late January, early February. It could be kind of late April. So I think there's a lot of things that are out of DEFRA's control into some respects as to when these things get published because of political things and things like that. But I do know, having been involved in some of the working groups, is we've done all our reports. They've gone in. They are being reviewed by a core group from the TB Partnership, which includes farmers, vets, scientists, all of the sort of farming organisations, and British Cattle Veterinary Association and British Veterinary Association. And so it's happening. It's in process.
It should be sooner than later. It's not like it's 2 years down the line or whatever. It should be sooner than later. So just looking at the time, I think it's time we start to wrap this up. So any last words of wisdom, Sarah Tomlinson?
I've got two, if I may. One is that I probably downplayed the role that cattle vaccination could have, in that I said it wasn't a great vaccine. No vaccine is, but we know a third of cattle get no immunity. they just don't respond to it. A third will get some immunity, so it reduces the progression and development of the disease. But a third will get good immunity. And I think we all are comfortable talking about the R0 through COVID, and understanding that as long as we've got one animal not transmitting the infection to more than or less than one other animal, then we can have some level of control over disease spread. And then my final one, which is why I do all of this stuff and I get heavily involved in lots of things around TB, is I know TB affects people. I've worked as a farm vet for 20 odd years in the same area. Some of my farmers are, close friends. And I do know the impact that TB breakdowns and even just the stress of thinking about a TB test can have. So I know we've talked lightly and we've laughed and we've had a fun podcast, but TB is hard, but there is a lot of support out there that people can get in touch with. Just ring your mate and tell them how you feel, really, or TBAS or FCN, lots of different charities out there to support people, so you're not on your own, really.
Rachel?
I would absolutely second that, and the thing that's driven us to be involved and work on this for years is the impact it has on our clients. It's horrendous, and people get so frustrated because they feel powerless. It can be destroying livelihood, destroying the herd that you've built up over a whole lifetime. That's so frustrating to watch. So I think we just need to move into a new era of being allowed to take control, taking responsibility where we can, and collaborating and working together. And that's what I'd really like to see in the next few years, is everyone who's involved in this area to be working together and pulling in the same direction, and we can get somewhere with this.
Sarah Bolt?
I just want to echo what Rachel said. I think so many things within our industry, we don't work together enough, we don't collaborate. And I think that this is just an ideal opportunity for us to turn around and say, we all want to achieve the same thing, and let's all work together to achieve that. And say it's one of those things that's very close to my heart, as to trying to get the whole industry to work together. And I think it's really exciting that perhaps there's now another tool in the toolbox as well, for us to work with. And I just think it's a case of let's try and see what we can do.
Well, I think from my point of view, I want to echo what Sarah Tomlinson said a little bit. She sort of beat me to it, but I was sort of going to say, as while today we recognise that we've been talking about the technical aspects of this, as you say, we've tried to keep it fairly light. We do also appreciate that testing for TB, whether it's the actual test or the actual outcome, can be devastating. It can affect a farm emotionally as well as financially. And therefore, please, if you are struggling with it, then please do reach out to whoever you feel you need to, whether it is a friend, just to go and have a pint down the pub, or a recognised charity like FCN, and say there are others are out there that, talk to somebody, because this is stressful. And, you go on farm, and even just the test, the fact that if you're stuck under a regime of every 60 days, you've got to do a test. And for most people, that can take a week out of your life every 60 days. There's an immense stress from that. So, we do appreciate that while we're talking about the technical aspect of this, this is the actual effect it's having on farms. So, but otherwise, I'd like to thank both our guests for today. It's been fantastic to catch up with you both again, and to hear that there is something on the horizon. There is some result. I'm not going to say great results. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing to say, but it's given us another tool to try and make a positive step forward in the control of TB. I guess now we just need to wait for some of this guidance that Sarah said hopefully will be with us now in spring 2026. So let's wait for that and see what happens. And as I say, hopefully it will just allow a better control and ideally a better monitoring of TB in as you say, a cheaper, less stressful way, as we've already just alluded to. And I think that's one of the first points I made. So on that, I guess it's a goodbye from me.
It's a goodbye from me, and thank you to our guests.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Arm & Hammer Animal Nutrition are pleased to support Chewing the Cud podcast. We're all in when it comes to supporting healthy, productive farm animals. Please visit ahanimalnutrition.com for more information.
Thank you for listening to the Chewing the Cud podcast, where we bring you conversations for the dairy industry produced in the southwest of England and listened to around the world. And now for the really boring bit, I'm afraid, the legal disclaimer. The information provided during this podcast has been prepared for general information purposes only and does not constitute advice. Information must not be relied upon for any purpose, and no representation or warranty is given to its accuracy, completeness, or otherwise. Any reference to other organisations, businesses or products during the podcast are not endorsements or recommendations of Chewing the Cud Limited. The views of Andrew Jones are personal and may not be the views of Chewing the Cud Limited, and the views of Sarah Bolt are personal and may not be the views of Kingshay Farming and Conservation Limited and any affiliated companies. For more information on the podcast and details of services offered by Chewing the Cud Limited, visit www.chewingthecud.com. Thank you and goodbye.